Good afternoon. I'm Molly Young from the Miami University Alumni Association. As part of the Miami University Alumni Association's webinar series, today we present Teaching Disability History to Miami Undergraduates and Why It's Important. Joining us for today's conversation are Education, Health, and Society faculty member Dr. Kate Rousmaniere and second-year PhD student Jaimie Biermann. Welcome to you both. Just a little background and bio on our two presenters today. Dr. Kate, as she is known to most of her students, is a professor of the history of education in the Department of Educational Leadership, that's EDL for short, in the College of Education, Health, and Society here at Miami. A faculty member at Miami since 1992, Dr. Kate has served as department chair and in 2016 was awarded the Miami University Benjamin Harrison Medallion for extraordinary and sustained contributions relating to teaching, research, and service over the course of a faculty member's career for the university. Her research centers on the history and politics of American educators, particularly the history of teachers, teacher activists, and school administrators. Jaimie Biermann, as I mentioned, is a second-year PhD student in educational leadership here at Miami. Before beginning her time with the program, Jaimie worked in different residence life roles at multiple institutions. Jaimie's current research focus is on disability and access in higher education. Welcome to you both, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. Just a reminder to our audience, some questions were collected during registration, and Dr. Kate and Jaimie will attempt to address some of those throughout the webinar today. You'll also have the option to ask questions during the webinar by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of your video screen. Please note that in the interest of time we have available, we may not get to every question, but we'll certainly try. Today's webinar will last about an hour, including time for those questions and answers. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jaimie to get us started with some questions for Dr. Kate. Thank you both.
Thank you, Molly, for the introductions and for having us here today. So I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Kate for a little bit about her history and passion for disability research. And so, Dr. Kate, I'm going to start off with the question, what sparked your interest in disability history?
Hi, Jaimie. Hi, everybody. What sparked my interest in disability history? I'm a historian of education, and so my research is in the history of education, teachers, school administrators. And about 10 years ago, I was president of the International History of Education Society. And the guy who had been president before me said, you have to go meet the Disability History Group because we're going to co-sponsor a conference with them while you're president. So I said, I didn't even know there was such a group. I didn't know such a field even existed. But I happened to be in San Francisco for my nephew's wedding. And the two presidents of that association were in San Francisco, working at San Francisco State. So I met them and suddenly was like, wow, I had this complete fast, like immediate introduction to immersion in disability history. And it was sort of an accident. I tell that story because it's sort of an accident, which is what disability is like. I mean, disability often happens as a result of an accident. 20% of Americans are or will become disabled at some point, often because of an accident or some random event, or you broke a leg or you had knee surgery or something like that. So the randomness of coming into this field is something I like to say. Then I got so interested in the field that I wrote an article that applied disability history lens to my own history of education thinking. It's called Those Who Can't Teach. And it's about the idea that we have a common saying in education that if you can't do anything else, if you're too dumb or disabled or incompetent, then you can become a teacher. So we always say that and kind of laugh about it, but to me, that also raised the idea about what do we think about disability if we say that's what, that's how we think about disabilities in that way. So I went through the history of education and wrote a bit about how the lens of disability history has impacted the way we think about the teaching profession over the years. And that really spurred my interest. And then I started teaching this disability history class, and it's been fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Kate. So what specific problems or challenges do you and your students seek to address in the classes that you teach on disability? And what type of information is covered overall in these courses?
This is an introductory class on the history of disability in America. Some of the students are disability studies students. They use it as part of their minor or requirement. And some of them are students who are just taking it because it seems interesting to them. So for some students, this is new information. For most students, the history is new information, but for some, it's newer than others. The main thing I cover at first is this very popular concept in disability studies which is the difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. The medical model of disability is thinking about disability as an individual medical problem that can be cured. The social model of disability is thinking about how society makes someone with different kinds of features, makes their life difficult. So, for example, a great example is that of ramps. If I'm using a wheelchair and I go to a building and there are only stairs, then that's society. That's not my problem, really. Society made that problem because they didn't create ramps for my ability to access that building. So first we work on the medical and social model of disability, and then proceed through a pretty chronological history of disability in the United States, and the theme of that history tends to go this way. Up until about 1970, the history of disability was pretty dismal. People with disabilities were always treated as a lesser person. They were institutionalized. They were seen as people who needed to be fixed. Then in the 1970s, there's a disability rights movement that emerges. And so we spend the last 2 weeks really focusing on the disability rights movement, which gets us into more elements of activism and agency for people with disabilities. It's a much more positive part of the class.
Great. It's a great class, by the way, side note. And so what have you learned about creating accessible classes in an online format? And what should folks think about if they do want to create an accessible online environment for a meeting or class, or whatever type of group that you might be meeting online with?
Well, COVID, as we all know, sort of opened up this possibility to a lot of other people because suddenly we're doing a lot more stuff online. And that's been great in terms of accessibility, physical accessibility. I regularly meet with some people around the nation, around the country now, on Zoom. So physically, I mean, I can actually see people now better. As long as you have a computer access, and that's the big issue that's facing K-12 schools, which is that for students for families who have computer access and good internet accessibility, then it really works. You can really connect with anybody around the world. For those who don't, I mean, there's this digital divide that is a real problem that we're facing. For people with disabilities, Zoom, this kind of online thing is really effective because if you physically can't get to a school classroom, or maybe you have a mental health issue and you feel uncomfortable in a classroom with a crowd and you don't want to be around people, an online class is really great. It's really accessible. My class is asynchronous, which means I'm rarely doing what we're doing right now, which is talking to you in a synchronous way. Instead, what I do is I post a short video of me introducing the topic for the week to students, and then they have all week to read and reply to the materials for the week, and they post on a discussion forum 3 times a week. And that often, I've found, is sometimes 3 times more that students will engage with material than they would have if they were in class. I mean, they have 3 times they've got to respond to the material. So that means students really have to respond to the material. The other great thing about disability studies and online learning is that there are a lot of great videos, fantastic number of videos that are on the history of disability, and those are even more accessible for people as well.
Yeah, and I would also add the podcast that you post, so you have the mixed forms of sharing that information.
Right, and students can also produce their own podcast for a final project too. Students don't have to write. I try and be as flexible to all types of learning mods as I can.
Yeah. And so how can learning about disability history, particularly within education, lead to tangible change and improvements to access and equity for this disabled community at large?
I think the social and medical model concept that I talked about earlier really opens up people's minds to what a problem is for a lot of different identities. So, is the problem that faces people of color, that are they the problem, or is it that society is not welcoming to people and accessible to people of color? So that whole model, that whole way of thinking about moving from an individual having a problem to society having a problem is something that I think really impacts my students as they go through this class. It's sort of, yeah, you introduce it and then it sort of leaks into what they're thinking and they start bringing it up in other ways. The other part of the class that I really like is that this last part where we talk about disability activism. And what happened in the 70s is that people with disabilities, with all different kinds of disabilities, began to unite and work together for issues of disability. So sometimes people ask me, is your class about the history of people with physical disabilities or mental cognitive disabilities? And I say, everybody. You know, it's a very inclusive field in and of itself, because we're talking about people who are considered external to and marginal to a social concept of a norm. And how that process developed over time is really interesting to students.
Yeah, it definitely is. Thus, my research. So, why do you think the program continues to grow in popularity when it comes to the disability minor or folks just being interested in taking the disability course? And what kind of long term benefits might we expect from understanding disability history and increasing disability awareness in higher ed?
One of the things that continues to amaze me about this class is the students, many of the students have disability in their lives. They have siblings or parents, or they themselves identify as having some kind of disability. Maybe they use student disability services. Maybe they don't identify as having a disability, but they have mental health issues. And so one of the most interesting parts of this class is the way, particularly the online format, students begin to self-disclose and kind of work through their own identity and begin to claim and understand what it is that they're going through and how they can better approach their life in the future. So I find that sort of that personal experience that students have to be really great. Students will sometimes tell me just personally, write me just personally, or they'll talk about it in a discussion forum about a family member or a friend or a neighbor or themselves and some of the issues that they struggle with. And then they learn about that through the history. So they take the class. Oftentimes these students take the class, and like me, when I first was introduced to the field, they have no idea what it's about. They're like, oh, this fulfills a lot of different requirements and it's online and that's great. So let me take it. So they take it. And then like within the second week, they're like, wow, this is really interesting. Like this has me thinking really differently about the world, myself, my brother who has an anxiety disorder, my father who is a cancer survivor. I'm suddenly beginning to think differently about the world in which I live. And somehow the history part of it kind of sneaks in on them. Like if they were taking a disability studies class, they'd be, I know I'm doing disability studies, but somehow because it's history, they don't really think they're going to get into contemporary issues or thinking about themselves, and yet they do. And it's really wonderful to see.
Yeah, some great conversations and discussion posts in seeing how they grow and develop in recognizing the role that disability has played throughout history, or the concept of disability.
Someone asked a question. That people asked a question in the comments that I wanted to talk about. One was a great question about the difference between tolerance, accessibility, integration, and inclusion in disability. And that's something that we certainly get into in this class as well. One concept I want to raise for this group that's just really provocative is the idea of inspiration porn. That's what it's called, inspiration porn. And it's the idea that, I'll actually read, there's a Wikipedia reading of it. There's an idea that we portray people with disabilities as inspirational solely or in part on the basis of their disability. So a lot of students come in and they'll say something like, in my high school graduating class, my Down syndrome classmate was elected prom king. And isn't that cool? So the first thing I'll say is that kid was not allowed in school until about 40 years ago. So there's one historically. Let's just think about that, how that kid is actually in school and is now in some kind of inclusion program, or at least a special ed program in school. And then secondly, to think about this inspiration porn idea, which is like, why is that good? It's great that kid is popular and he was elected, but is there some way in which we're being kind of patronizing and maybe using people's disability in a way that's kind of uncomfortable? So students begin to think about that when they're thinking about things about tolerance. I thought about this because of the question about tolerance, accessibility, integration, and inclusion. Inclusion is really including everybody for all our differences. Because I wear glasses, because someone's in a wheelchair, because someone has cerebral palsy, we're all humans and we're all in this together. And that's a really inclusion versus sort of using somebody in a different kind of way. Those are the kind of concepts that really get us thinking. I want to turn now to Jaimie and ask Jaimie about what she's doing, because Jaimie's doing research. My research is not specifically in history of disability now. I mostly just teach this class and keep up with my readings, of which there is a lot. But I'm going to ask Jaimie because she's doing her dissertation research on disability history in higher education. So I'm going to ask her some of the same questions. How did you become interested in disability?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kate. So I had knee surgery a few years ago and had to be in a wheelchair. Was living by myself and was living on campus in one of my residence life roles, and I quickly found out all of the challenges and barriers that students with disabilities can face. And I was temporarily disabled, and so it really made me think about spaces and how to make sure that, not only the structure of buildings, but how things are set up. I came across a lot of doors where the push buttons didn't work, the elevators were down. It took me an hour to get to meetings across campus, and I can only imagine the continual everyday energy that is put into students with disabilities attending different campuses. And as it was mentioned earlier, I've been at multiple institutions in different residence life roles. And so this moment for me really made me think about the previous institutions and the lack of not only access, but the lack of training that I had and the lack of knowledge that I had about students and faculty, staff, colleagues with disabilities. And so that really opened my eyes to the fact that I really needed to take the chance and opportunity to learn more about it and how to assist in the creation of these equitable experiences for students on campus, especially because I do plan on continuing my career within higher education. And so a lot of my class focus, of course, my dissertation will be focused on disability, but it was a really good opportunity that opened my eyes to, just the fact that we have a lot of changes that need to be made to create those equitable opportunities for students.
So here's the question that doctoral students are always asked, but may not want to answer, but you're going to answer it now, which is what is your proposed research on the history of disabilities in higher education? Tell us what you're interested, what you're thinking of doing.
Yeah, so I am interested, it was mentioned earlier, on disability and then access within higher education. But a little more specifically, I'm looking at the history of policies and how that changed the makeup of college campuses, or how it didn't. The continual barriers that students face, even with the policies that are in place. I've done reading on the disability movement, which Dr. Kate has, she discussed a little bit earlier. We did have a question from someone regarding the most successful part of the disability movement and the biggest failure of the disability movement. And so I personally don't know what the biggest failure would be. I would say that there are a lot of changes that need to be made and a lot of restructuring the way what people see as the norm, so that even with the policies that are in place, it still leaves a lot of folks with disabilities out. And so the success was that some policies were put in place that mandated changes that needed to be made for folks with disabilities that wouldn't have been made or hadn't been made up until that point. But there is a need to continue that work. And so I would equate that maybe to the biggest failure. I will be looking at how institutions have changed or not changed as policies have been implemented, and we'll probably focus on one or a couple of those. And so I'm not sure specifics yet, but that is where I see my research going.
What do you think are the greatest issues greatest disability issues facing higher education today?
Yeah, I think just overall, the first thing I think of is a lack of knowledge. There are some campuses that are in many articles, they've been really thinking about the design and structure and support system and resources that folks with disabilities need while on campus. But overall, at least in my experience, there's a lack of training for everyone on campus on how to support all students, if they are coming in with a disability and, have an accommodation that they've asked for. But there are students, because of the stigmas, that they don't want to share that they have a disability. But how can we create an environment where they don't even have to ask for those accommodations? So one of the things that is brought up in literature is universal design. And that is a concept where folks in all levels, in all spaces, are creating it in a way where it's not disabling to anybody. And so no one has to go out and share or, kind of balance. Like, I know the stigmas, are people going to look at me different? Because they don't have to do that because they have access into that. And so I would say the training and knowledge is one big part. I would also say the rise in mental health on campuses. Anxiety disorders, in my experience, have been on the rise for many different reasons. And so I think institutions of higher education really need to think about how to support those students, their student population, and what disabilities they might be coming to campus with, especially with the rise in those numbers. There's also been an increase in numbers of students on the autism spectrum. And so another important thing to consider is, distractions, whether it's where they're living or in the classroom. What kinds of technology are you using? So it really is thinking about the details and how they can affect the learning process for students. Moving classes online, there are a lot of perks to it, but you have to be knowledgeable on how to create an accessible online format. And so Miami University, for example, I've learned a lot about different programs you can use to check if like Canvas, the site that we use for classes, is accessible. If you're creating documents, what can be used by readers that students might be using for class. And overall thinking through even color choices so that folks can easily read content. And so utilizing those resources has been really great. I still have things to learn, and will continue to do that to ensure that, as we move more so into technology land, which we have a lot, that I'm aware of how to create that environment. And I would say overall, just thinking through all of the experiences that students have on campus, from the moment that they are applying to the moment that they graduate and even beyond, thinking through how to create those accessible and equitable opportunities for them so they can be, they can enjoy their experience in higher ed, because everybody has the right and should be having that successful and fulfilling opportunity on campus.
I really like that, the universal design concept, which I think originally came from architecture. But
yes, it did. Yep.
Yeah, I'm doing some work now with senior citizens, of which I'm one too. And if we're lucky, we will all become senior citizens. And universal design is an important concept for seniors too, because it includes stuff like accessibility of a home. Is your home accessible for when you have knee surgery, or when you maybe have some trouble getting around? Is your kitchen counter, there's some really terrific architectural designs of kitchen counters that are lower so that people don't have to stand up to be at the kitchen counter. So that's good. I also just want to give a plug for Miami University. I agree with Jaimie that all universities, we need to think more broader about it. I think what a lot of universities have done is address when the American Disabilities Act came out in 1990, cities, communities, and universities and schools made efforts to follow the ADA requirements, but many of those are still developing. And it's that 1990, that was a long time ago. But Miami has done some great things. One thing they've done is the Miller Center for Student Disability Services. And this was endowed by the Millers, Scott and Susan Miller, class of 61, who endowed a big center, a beautiful center for student disability services. And this is where students go to get their accommodations for their classes, and advising and counseling and a lot of other things. They have 5 staff members there. And there's also a staff member on both Hamilton and Middletown campus. So students who have disability needs and identify as having a need will go there. And there's a whole process that we go through now. This has been required by ADA and other laws, but actually Miami's really doing it really well. The other thing that we've got a disability studies minor, of which this class is one of the requirements for, and a thematic sequence. And those classes are getting more and more popular, I think, because disability studies is getting a reputation as being a great, really exciting field, which it is. There's also the endowed Kate Welling Disability Awareness Lecture Series and Distinguished Scholar in Residence. This was endowed by the family of Kate Welling, who was a disability studies student who died in a tragic off-campus fire in 2005. And so the parents endowed a visiting residence, a scholar in residence, disability studies scholar in residence, who comes and teaches usually every spring a capstone class, and then also a lecture series, which we also have in the spring. Then there's also a student group called Students with Disabilities Advisory Council. The Students with Disability, I mean, it does have what Jaimie mentioned. There's that question of claiming the identity of disability, which is, a struggle for a lot of people for a lot of reasons. But there's also efforts to sort of encourage people to do that and to work together so that they can work together on common and their own issues. So Miami, I think, is doing pretty well. There are all sorts of, struggles. Not all the buildings are there's a building may be technically accessible to someone with physical disabilities, but not actually, not easily accessible. So we certainly have those issues. We have a lot of old buildings at Miami, and so those are struggles that the university has to get through. And my hope, I try to be positive about these things, is that this will happen more and more. And then I agree with Jaimie, the kind of current issue I face with Miami students in all of my classes now are mental health issues, anxiety, depression, some reading disorders, things like ADHD. And those are often, if they're documented, then we have something to work with through the Students with Disability Services. Sometimes they're not documented and the student wants to talk about it. And then I'm in a funny position of I'm not an expert in this field, but I certainly want to hear students. So those are increasing on college campuses.
Yeah, I would also say just numbers in general, as folks do more research, there are, I'm sure they've always been around, but labels for different types of identities and what that means. And I think that will continue to be the case. It has grown, or at least it seems like it's grown from acknowledgement of just like grouping everyone together, and now slowly recognizing that every disability comes with unique challenges and barriers. And so my hope as well is in the future, you really can understand like how to change things to make it accessible for everybody.
And we do this in this class. I do want to. I got one plug, which is this book. Whoa, can I put? Okay, so if you want to read anything, this is a textbook we use, which is incredible. It's called A Disability History of the United States by Kim Nielsen. It's about 5 years old. And it offers this really great introduction to the history of disability from pre-contact. There's a great chapter on indigenous folks in North America, and then all the way up through the modern disability rights movement. That offers a great kind of chronological and fantastic stories about issues, history of disability, in many ways. And then like I said, there are a lot of great websites. The Disability History Association has a lot of great sources. There are a bunch of online archives and libraries. There's a disability history library. The podcast, we've got fantastic podcasts that we use in class from a lot of different scholars who are now making podcasts, which are a cool new innovation that weren't around when I started teaching. Short, I try and keep the material I assign pretty short. So like a podcast that's 10 to 15 minutes is sort of the maximum. And then, of course, I also urge students to watch Crip Camp, which is a full movie.
I was just about to add that.
Yeah, we got to add that. Crip Camp came out last year, won an award, didn't it? Didn't it win an Academy Award for a documentary?
I think so. And it's free to watch.
And it's free to watch on YouTube. Crip Camp, yeah. And it's a history. It starts with a camp for kids with disabilities in the 60s or 70s. And then how kids in that camp began to gain sort of identity and autonomy and agency, and then which basically accelerated into the disability rights movement. And then it covers some of the major disability rights movements, many of which happened on higher education campuses. So yeah, I'd really urge you to watch that. That's a full-length documentary called Crip Camp. It's fantastic.
Yeah, there's so many different formats for sharing the history because there's so many different aspects of it. Great book. So I second the book suggestion. But yeah, even short articles, longer articles, there's everything out there about it. Not everything, it still needs to be researched, but there's a lot of great information and resources out there for folks who want to learn more.
So Molly, we're ready to take questions, I think. Are we? We'll just keep talking about it.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I mean, this conversation, I think, has so much value, if for no other reason than it really sort of puts something right in front of you that you're like, aha. Oh my goodness, I hadn't even, when you're never forced to put yourself in a position of being different or being disadvantaged or just generally, unable. You really, sometimes you just don't think of it. And I really think that, while it's important for your students who come from families with disabled, family members or it's in their life somewhere, I feel like we should make everyone participate in these classes just for this sole purpose of like elevating our consciousness level and to be more in tune. I feel like the work that needs to be done to create this, environment of inclusion, integration, and all of that stuff kind of starts with just putting it in our brain in the first place. And, if you don't have to think about it, so many times you don't. So I think there's so much value in what you're doing and just putting it sort of in front of people so they can look at it and be like, oh my goodness, that's right, or wrong, as the case may be. So thank you for the work you're doing. And I think this is just fascinating. We do have a couple questions that have come in. Sarah actually was asking about sort of disabilities that perhaps maybe you can't see. She specifically mentions generalized anxiety disorder. Are these qualifiable as traditional disabilities, assuming there's documentation to support that?
Yep. Yeah. A common term is called invisible disabilities.
Or non-apparent as well, as I've read that in some articles. Yeah.
That's good too. Yeah. And I actually have a student in another one of my classes right now who has an anxiety. She says she has an anxiety disorder. It's been identified by her doctors. So she actually has the paperwork. So I said, do you want to go to Student Disability Services? get some support. And she said, and she is great. She said, I don't know if I really want to claim it yet. Now, this is something that will help her. I said, it will help you. But she, she's not obligated to claim this identity. She sort of wants to keep working it through or do something else. So that's the issue with non-apparent or invisible disabilities, is it's not as easy for outsiders to sort of identify it. And maybe that's good. It puts it on, but then it puts the onus on the individual. And so the individual's got to sort of wrestle with that.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Oh, your co-star, Jaimie. That's really
I know.
I love that.
Become famous.
I love that. I always think it adds a level of authenticity when you have a little guest appearance. Let's see. This is a question from Kara, and it's a kind of a long one, but I'll read it all because I think you need all the information. She's an instructional designer for Miami Regional's eCampus, and she's very proud of our proactive accessibility practices. All the online courses are developed through their department rather, and are designed with accessibility sort of top of mind. She says one of the things she's noticed is a move toward a more open education resources, OERs, which are great for so many, but oftentimes the resources might be, she says, PDFs that have to be that have not been remediated. I'm wondering if you've noticed any of these conversations between OER and accessibility.
I love e-learning. E-learning is doing a great job. I thought Kara might talk about, maybe she's too polite to say this, but I'll say this, that in developing online classes, especially last year, there were a lot of faculty who didn't know, who weren't thinking about disability. So it didn't even occur to them to make so this issue about a PDF is not accessible, but a doc is. So faculty just didn't know that. And it probably fell on the e-learning people to teach people that. Same with, there's some YouTube, most of the YouTube videos that I use are captioned, or you can request captioning, but sometimes the captions are really not very good. And sometimes they're not captioned at all. Ironically, some things about some disability videos are not captioned. So captioning's another issue. And I think there's probably a whole range of issues with technology that probably Kara knows more about. Jaimie, you got it?
I feel like, there's, just like in general disability knowledge, there's opportunities to work on technology. Canvas, the platform again that is used for classes, they have, I continue to learn about different options that folks can utilize. So when, for example, a faculty member, when Dr. Kate uploads a document, like a PDF, you can download it in alternative formats. And so you can make it an MP3 audio bit, which is pretty monotone, but it is, for folks that, need to listen to that. Or you can download it in a format that can be read on different devices, or there's like 10 different formats. And so I think that's really great. But again, it's just becoming aware of that. And there's an overall accessibility check in Canvas. There's also one in Word. If you're creating a document and you want to use images, for example, you should put alt text so that folks that are using a reader, they can understand what the picture is. So it has been improved. There are different skills and things you can utilize, but I wasn't aware of them, and I'm still learning, and I'm sure there's other things out there that folks can utilize. And so definitely room for improvement and changes in training and knowledge, but I have appreciated learning what's in place. And Canvas is the first thing that came to mind.
Another part of that Jaimie, I wanted to tell you about anyway, was I was reading the Miami Student the other day, and a student was writing about how Canvas, the platform works, but that faculty are adding all these other sites. Maybe that's what Kara is referring to. Like there's so many different kinds of gadgets you can use in an online class. And this student was talking, who did not didn't at least publicly identify as someone with any kind of learning disorder, but he said it's really confusing. You know, I go to class and one professor wants you to do this, another wants you to do this, and you got to click on this and that side. So I think in general, and that's a problem that I find with online learning in general, when I've taken online learning classes, people want to give me a lot of new stuff. And I think, yeah, a lot of new stuff is really great, but sometimes it just makes things more confusing. And for a student who's already maybe not really accessible to learning, that would be even harder.
Yeah, I mean, if a student doesn't know, they don't know. And there's the opportunity to change formats, for example, but I was not aware of that until I had been using Canvas for a while. And so I think it's also just finding ways to educate students on what's there, because you're right, there are so many options, but too many options can make it really challenging.
I wonder if sort of the necessity for online learning and online classrooms through COVID, I wonder if that will prove to be maybe not a turning point, but sort of some impetus for more thought and maybe a more holistic approach to what accessibility looks like for all students on an online platform. I wonder if maybe that will just be a catalyst for some more quick change, because, you know, as you mentioned, the ADA was 1990. I mean, that's a long time ago now, you know, and if we're still really trying to get our ducks in a row, you know, to be compliant, we've had a long time to get ducks in rows, and still, I think, are coming up short. So what do you think are the greatest barriers to making education more disability friendly? I know, you know, cost is certainly one of them when it comes to like access to buildings. Do you have other ideas to expand upon that might enlighten us?
Well, kind of a million, maybe. Well, I mean, one is the very concept of education is that people ought to be smart. So that in and of itself is a limiting way of thinking, like smart at what, you know?
Right.
So grade point averages and people doing well on written papers and standardized tests, those kinds of things. And those are issues that are often raised in disability studies and in, I think, general learning environments. And it's hard to get out of that. I mean, I was raised pretty traditionally and I really like written papers, but I am learning that that many students perform better and can articulate themselves better if they're reading something into a podcast or maybe making a PowerPoint. I mean, it's partially generational, and I think it's partially may have to do with different ways of learning, different models of learning. So I think opening that up is hard. That's a challenge in K-12 education and in higher education. And the whole idea of special education, for example, is something that's really challenged in disability studies, because special education implies that there are these different people and we're going to put them over there and give them special treatment. Mm-hmm. So that's not what we mean by inclusion. On the other hand, if we didn't have special education, some students might not even have any ability to go to school. So I think furthering that development, and every year, I think it gets a little better. It's a challenge. Jaimie, what do you got?
Yeah, I would say one of the challenges is also with ADA, and it was updated a little bit in 2008. It's with the ADAAA. But even with that, it's very baseline. And so if there are structures being built, which there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to accessibility, and that's why a lot of institutions who have been around for a while, if you don't have the funding or the time to, you know, make all these changes, it takes a long time. But the ADA is baseline because there are, you know, continual research and acknowledgement of disabilities that weren't labeled in the past. And so I think, you know, just understanding that you should not only think about the ADA, but how can you go above and beyond? And I think change in general is a big thing. Dr. Kate, you kind of alluded to that, but it's rewiring your brain to think about things in a different format or multiple formats. for students, and even for faculty and staff. Like, how can you create an accessible environment for them on campus? And so, yeah, the concept of change and what we've been socialized into thinking is the norm. That can be challenging.
And then I have one last question, and I was just curious to know if you think this would move the needle in any way. But I understand Miami is going for an age-friendly university designation. Do you feel or find that that may make a difference one way or the other as it relates to overall accessibility here on campus? I've heard some grumblings in various places about even new buildings maybe not being as accessible as they could be for the disabled population. So I'm wondering if we, sort of take this backdoor approach to accessibility by starting with access for the elderly. Do you think that at all will be beneficial to the sort of overarching goal of accessibility for everyone?
That's an interesting question. And actually, aging is sort of the area my research is going in now, thinking about what we think about old teachers and old administrators. I mean, what do we think about old people? And so actually that gets to I love the age-friendly concept. Oxford is age-friendly Oxford. It's a designation from AARP and other organizations to sort of further work that will provide more accessibility and attention to older people. The problem I'm having, I just faced yesterday. Just yesterday, I was talking to a friend about how I'm on the board of the senior center. And I said, are you a member? And she said, oh, no, I don't feel like I'm an old person. And she's 70. And I said, well, you are. She said, yeah, but I don't feel that way. So on and on she went about how she didn't feel old. And I said, well, we don't feel like we're old because we've never been old before. So, of course, this is going to be a new feeling. But there's still a stigma against aging. And so that it would be great if Miami became age-friendly university and kind of addressed that stigma. And the program in social gerontology at Miami is so great in that way. They offer the kind of different kinds of thinking about inclusivity across the age span, the lifespan that would suggest some really great stuff. That would be nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say something. I don't know if I haven't done the research on it, but if you have folks from different age groups coming in, a lot of folks do develop additional or new disabilities as they get older, because as you get older, your body changes. And again, it goes back to like maybe how you were raised and the stigmas around having a disability. And so are all students of all ages willing to get accommodations or even accept and acknowledge that their body is changing? And so I think, if we are thinking about how to create, again, that environment from the beginning so that all students don't feel the pressure to think about like what folks might think of them or perceive of them from the moment that they arrive on campus, that would avoid just the challenge of thinking through the perception that you might have.
Fantastic. Well, ladies, this has been just a fantastic conversation. I think I could probably sit here and keep talking to you and asking you questions, but in the interest of time, we'll wrap up our lunch hour discussion. Thank you both very much for being here and sort of planting these little seeds that I think we could all grow and expand upon. Certainly from a perspective of I'm not disabled, but how can we help those who are and what can we do? And for our viewing audience, I just want to remind you that a recording of this presentation will be available probably around 2 later this afternoon. And thank you again to Dr. Kate Rousmaniere and my new favorite PhD student, Jaimie Biermann, for the conversation today. We really appreciate you being here. And check out that book, that Dr. Kate and Jaimie recommended, A Disability History of the United States by Kim Nielsen. There it is. I don't think we know Kim, but shameless plug for her. I don't.
Right. She works at University of Toledo, so she's an Ohioan. That's good.
Well, there we go. 3 cheers for Ohio.
And there's also an Audible version if you want to listen to it on your travels.
Also making it a little bit more accessible.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Thank you for that suggestion. And for everybody out there, please check out this webinar again if you'd like, and our other archived webinar presentations at alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you all for joining us today. Love and honor to everyone. Have a great afternoon.